The rain fell in soft, persistent sheets against the tall windows of the king's private study, blurring the ancient oaks of the estate into a watercolor of greens and grays. Inside, the fire crackled with a warmth that seemed unable to reach the three figures standing in its glow. King Charles stood rigid by the mantel, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the flames, as if they held the answers to a lifetime of questions. Beside him, his wife, Queen Camilla, sat in a high-backed chair, her usual composure fractured by the quiet, shuddering sobs that escaped her lips. And a few feet away, the Princess of Wales, Kate, stood silently by the door, her presence a quiet sentinel in the midst of the emotional storm. It was a scene that few would ever believe could happen. For decades, the narrative had been written in stone. While Camilla was the other woman, the architect of a marriage's destruction, the woman the public loved to hate. For William and Harry, she was the source of their mother's deepest pain, a figure associated with the tumultuous breakdown of their parents' marriage and the dark years that followed. The tension between the princes and their father's wife had been a cold war fought with polite smiles and clipped words for as long as anyone could remember. Yet here, in this private moment, the lines were blurred. Camilla's cries were not those of a triumphant queen, but of a woman crushed by the weight of a decades-long legacy she could never escape. The catalyst for this breakdown was a small, seemingly innocuous headline in a Sunday paper. It was a retrospective piece marking the anniversary of a particular event. At dredging up the infamous Camillagate tapes of 1989, where a young Prince Charles had told his lover he wished to be reincarnated as a tampon so he could live inside her. For the public, it was a historical curiosity. For Camilla, it was a fresh wound being salted. The comment section online had been merciless, filled with vitriol that referenced Diana, called her names, and wished her ill. For years, she had built a wall of dignity, never responding, never flinching. But walls, built over decades, can sometimes crumble in a single night. Charles had found her that morning in their private quarters, not dressed for the day, but sitting on the edge of their bed, the tablet displaying the articles lying beside her. She wasn't just sad. She was broken in a way he had rarely seen. "Will it ever stop, Charles?" she had whispered, her voice hoarse. "I am 75 years old. I have served. I have done everything asked of me. And to them, I am still just the Rottweiler," the name Diana had famously called her. Charles had tried to comfort her, his own guilt and defensiveness rising to the surface. But it only made things worse. He had inadvertently become the architect of her public destruction, and his attempts to soothe her felt like apologies he could never fully articulate. That was when Kate had arrived. She had come to discuss a charity initiative, but was met at the door by a tense equerry who whispered of the atmosphere inside. Kate, with her innate emotional intelligence, understood immediately. She didn't knock and barge in. She simply asked for tea to be brought, and she waited. When Charles had emerged, looking haggard, to ask for a moment, but Kate had gently placed a hand on his arm. "She's not just the queen, Papa," Kate said softly, using her familiar name for him. "She's a person. Let her feel it." And so Kate had entered the room. She didn't speak. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply stood there, a silent pillar of support for her father-in-law, while witnessing the raw, unfiltered grief of her mother-in-law. It was an extraordinary position to be in. This was the woman who, according to some biographers, had once been so jealous of the attention William and Kate received that she had urged Charles to tell his son to drop her. This was the woman whose very presence had once caused such friction between William and his father that their relationship was on the verge of collapse. But Kate had always been a pragmatist and a peacemaker. So from the moment she joined the family, she had seen the dynamic not as a fairy tale battle of good versus evil, but as a complicated, fractured family in desperate need of healing. She had quietly worked to build bridges, finding common ground with Camilla over their shared love of art and country life, often visiting exhibitions together without the men. She knew that the narrative was more complex than the public knew. As Camilla's sobs quieted to whimpers, she finally looked up. Her eyes, red and swollen, met Kate's. There was a flicker of something, embarrassment perhaps, or a lifetime of guardedness. But Kate didn't flinch. She offered no judgment, only a look of profound and simple understanding. In that look she was saying, "I see you. Not the queen, not the other woman. Just you." Charles, observing this silent exchange, felt a lump form in his throat. This was the family he had always wished for, a family not bound by duty and public perception, but by the quiet, difficult work of understanding. Kate's silence was louder than any declaration of support he could have made. It was an acceptance that encompassed all the pain and all the history, and chose, in this moment, to simply be present. It was, he realized, the most powerful gift she could give them all. The echoes of that tearful morning lingered in Clarence's house for days. The silence that had been so heavy with sorrow began to shift, replaced by a new, tentative quiet, one of unspoken acknowledgement. For Charles, the memory of Kate standing by the door, a silent guardian of their shared vulnerability, became a touchstone. He saw his daughter-in-law with new eyes, and not just as the brilliant future queen, but as the emotional keystone of his family. But the most significant change was in the air between him and Camilla. Her breakdown had peeled back a layer of their existence, revealing the raw, unhealed tissue of regret beneath. A week after the incident, Charles found himself walking with Camilla through the gardens of Highgrove, a place that held the ghosts of his past. They walked in silence for a while, the crunch of gravel under their feet the only sound. Finally, Charles stopped, turning to face her. "I failed you," he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion he rarely displayed. "All those years ago, I should have been braver. I should have stood up to everyone. My family, the press, the expectations. I should have fought for you from the start." Camilla looked at him, and her expression guarded but her eyes soft. They had talked about their past 1,000,000 times, but always in the context of strategy and survival. Never like this. Never with pure, unadulterated regret. "I was weak," Charles continued, the words tumbling out now. "I let them push me into a marriage I knew was a mistake for everyone involved, and you were left to carry the blame. For all of it." He was referring, of course, to Diana. He was finally articulating the guilt that had festered for decades, not just for the failure of his first marriage, but for the fact that the woman he loved had been cast as the villain in a tragedy he had written. Camilla reached out and took his hand. Her own hands, aged and elegant, squeezed his. "We were young," she said, her voice a whisper. "We were all young. And then we were all trapped in a system that no one could escape." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car on the drive. It was Kate. She stepped out of the Range Rover, her expression brightening when she saw them. She hesitated for a moment, sensing the intensity of the moment, but Charles waved her over. "Kate," he said, his voice regaining its usual composure, though his eyes were still bright. "Come, walk with us." As Kate joined them, falling into step beside Camilla, the dynamic was palpably different. The polite formality was gone, replaced by something warmer. Camilla, usually so adept at hiding her feelings behind a wall of charm, seemed softer, more present. "I hear you're off to that exhibition at the National Gallery tomorrow," Camilla said to Kate. "Yes," Kate replied. William claims he'd rather clean the stables, so I was going to go alone." "Nonsense," Camilla said, a hint of her old decisiveness returning. "I'll come with you. We can make a day of it. Perhaps a quiet lunch afterward, away from all this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the estate, the duties, the weight of their lives. Kate smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I would love that, Camilla." It was a small moment, an invitation to an art gallery, but its significance was monumental. This was the same Camilla who, according to royal lore, had once schemed to keep Kate out of the family. This was the woman whose arrival at family gatherings had once sent a chill through the room. Now she was actively seeking out Kate's company, not as a duty, but as a desire. As they walked, Camilla began to speak, haltingly at first. Asked about the pressures of being under constant scrutiny. She talked about the early days with Charles, the secret phone calls, the fear of being caught, the exhilarating, terrifying feeling of being in love with the future king. She spoke of the hate mail, the bread rolls thrown at her in the supermarket, the way people would sneer Rottweiler under their breath as she passed. She had never spoken to anyone in the family about this with such raw honesty. Kate listened. She didn't interrupt with sympathy or try to offer solutions. She just listened, absorbing the pain of a life lived in the shadows of public opinion. By the time they circled back to the house, an unspoken bond had been forged. It was a bridge built not of duty but of shared understanding. Two women who had married into the most famous family in the world, and knowing that their lives would never be their own. For Camilla, it was a release. For Kate, it was a revelation. This was her family now, in all its complicated, wounded, beautiful reality, and she was determined to help it heal. The atmosphere in the car on the way back from the gallery was light, filled with the easy chatter of two women who had discovered a mutual passion for the Impressionists. Kate and Camilla dissected the exhibition, pointing out their favorite pieces, laughing about the overly zealous security guard who had followed them too closely. It was a normal human interaction, a rarity in their gilded cage. But as the car approached the walls of the palace estate, the lightness began to fade, replaced by the familiar weight of duty. Waiting for them in the main drawing room was William. He had been in meetings all day, but the moment he saw Kate, his face softened. Then his gaze shifted to Camilla, and a flicker of the old, familiar tension crossed his features. It was an involuntary response, a muscle memory of grief and resentment. He excused himself, muttering something about needing to check on the children. Kate found him later in the nursery, sitting in a small chair, watching George and Charlotte build an impossibly tall tower of blocks. She didn't say anything at first. She simply sat on the floor beside him, her head resting against his knee. "You spent the day with her," William said, his voice flat. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of fact that hung in the air between them. "Yes," Kate said softly. "We had a lovely time, William. She's not who you think she is." William's jaw tightened. And he had spent a lifetime trying to reconcile the image of the woman who had caused his mother so much pain with the woman who now sat at his father's side. He had seen his father's happiness, and he had seen his mother's tears. The two truths could not coexist peacefully in his heart. She told me about the early days," Kate continued, her voice gentle but firm. "About how trapped they all felt. About the pressures from the family, from the palace. She's not a monster, William. She's a woman who made choices, some of them bad, and has paid for them every single day for 40 years. William finally looked down at her, his blue eyes filled with a storm of emotion. "You're asking me to forgive her." "I'm not asking you to forget," Kate said, reaching up to take his hand. "I would never ask you to forget your mother, or what you went through. But I am asking you to see the whole picture. Your father loves her. She makes him happy. And we are a family. We can't keep living with this cold war between us. It's poisoning everything." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft clatter of blocks. Finally, William let out a long, slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "Every time I look at her, I see my mother's face. I hear her voice." Kate stood up and knelt in front of him, her hands cupping his face. "I know, and that's okay. But maybe we start small. Not forgiveness, just presence. Just being in the same room without the walls up. For your father, for us, for the children." Meanwhile, across the palace, and Charles was sitting with Camilla in her sitting room. He noticed a change in her. The haunted look that had been present since her breakdown was gone, replaced by a quiet peace. "Kate is a remarkable woman," Camilla said, breaking the silence. "She listens. She doesn't judge. She just understands." Charles nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "She's the best thing that ever happened to that boy of mine, and to this family." Camilla looked at him, her eyes glistening. "I think she might be the best thing that ever happened to me, too. She looks at me, Charles, and she doesn't see the headlines. She just sees me." For the first time in her long and arduous journey into the heart of the royal family, Camilla felt a sense of belonging that wasn't contingent on Charles's love alone. She had found an ally in the most unexpected place, and Kate, in her quiet, determined way, had begun to weave the frayed threads of this family back together. The silence that had once spoken of pain and division was slowly being replaced by a new, more hopeful quiet. The calm before a potential peace. The Remembrance Sunday service at the cenotaph was always a day of profound national emotion, a time to honor the fallen. But for the royal family, it was also a public display of unity, a carefully choreographed performance of grief and respect. This year, however, the performance felt different. It felt real. King Charles stood at the cenotaph, his frame seeming more fragile than in years past. As he laid his wreath of poppies, the cameras captured the profound weight of the moment. His eyes, welling with tears, reflected not just the solemnity of the occasion, but a personal history of loss and duty. He stepped back, his movements careful and deliberate, and rejoined his family on the balcony of the Foreign Office. Standing there, watching him, was Camilla. As he approached, the years seemed to melt away. The expert body language analysts would later note the unusually powerful look of love and support she gave him. An asymmetric smile, lips closed, but her eyes soft and warm with an approval that spoke volumes. It was a non-verbal message, a silent, well done, that transcended the formality of the day. But the most significant moment was yet to come. As the choir began the national anthem, the cameras panned across the balcony. There stood the Queen and the Princess of Wales, side by side, dressed in black, yet their voices rising together in the solemn hymn. It was a powerful image of continuity, of the present and future of the monarchy united. As the anthem concluded, Camilla, without a word, turned slightly and placed her gloved hand gently on Kate's arm. It was a fleeting gesture, barely a second long, but it was a moment of profound connection. It was a silent thank you for the understanding, for the bridge building, for the quiet support in her darkest moment. It was a public acknowledgement of a private bond. Kate, in turn, offered the smallest of nods, her eyes meeting Camilla's. In that brief exchange, a lifetime of tension was acknowledged, and if not forgiven, then gently set aside. William, standing on the other side of Kate, observed the interaction. His expression remained stoic, the perfect mask of a future king. But those who knew him well might have noticed the slight softening around his eyes. He wasn't ready to embrace Camilla. Perhaps he never would be. But in that moment, watching his wife and his stepmother stand united, he felt the cold knot of resentment in his chest loosen. Just a little. Later, as the family gathered for a private lunch at Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The conversation was still polite, still measured, but the undercurrent of ice had thawed. The children, George and Charlotte, chattered away, their innocent energy filling the silences that had once been so heavy. As the lunch wound down, Charles stood, raising his glass. "A toast," he said, his voice clear and strong. "To family." Everyone raised their glasses. Camilla caught Kate's eye across the table and gave a small, grateful smile. William, after a moment's hesitation, raised his glass towards his father and then, in a gesture that surprised even himself, gave a slight nod in Camilla's direction. It was not a grand reconciliation. There were no tearful hugs or declarations of love. The scars of the past were still there, deep and permanent. Diana's memory was still a living, breathing presence in the room, but the silence that had once been filled with accusation and pain now held something new: acceptance. Charles, watching his family, felt a wave of emotion he couldn't name. For so long, he had been torn between the woman he loved and the sons he adored. He had carried the guilt of his choices like a physical weight. Now, seeing Kate's quiet influence, seeing his wife and his son in the same room without the air turning to ice, he felt a flicker of hope. That Kate had done what no amount of diplomacy or public relations could achieve. She had humanized them to each other. As the family dispersed, Kate found a quiet moment alone with Charles. He took her hand, his eyes brimming with the same emotion seen at the cenotaph. "Thank you, Kate," he said, his voice thick. "For everything." Kate simply squeezed his hand. No words were needed. The silence said it all. It was a silence of healing, of understanding, and of a family, against all odds, finally beginning to find its way home.